Hi, my name is Jared, and this is Horror Obsession. Today, I want to talk about one of my favorite horror movies of all time, Scream 1996, directed by the peerless Wes Craven. Scream holds a very special place in my heart because this is a movie made for people who absolutely love horror movies, and, well, I run a channel called Horror Obsession, so that fits me quite nicely. Just doing a normal review of this movie wouldn't do it justice, so I want to examine this movie in a bit more detail than I usually do, since there is honestly so much to talk about. One of the most commonly referenced things about this movie is the opening scene. However, I already talked about that quite a bit in my Horror October video, so check that out if you're curious. Scream is probably one of the most popular horror movies ever, and I don't mean in box office revenue, but rather in terms of cultural impact. There are a lot of iconic horror villains, since in many ways these stories are defined by the villains, and Ghostface is no exception. The mask and costume are now part of the collective consciousness of movie audiences around the world, and certainly on par with the other major slashers such as Freddy, Jason, or Leatherface. Scream was so good that it basically resurrected the entire slasher genre, which had developed a pretty rough reputation by the mid-90s.
In my professional opinion, this guy's deader than shit.
The new and innovative characters of the 80s, such as Freddy, had been repeated ad nauseum in endless, creatively bankrupt sequels, and audiences were sick of it and ready for basically anything else. Scream brought slashers back in a major way, and even influenced what many today would consider to be the elevated horror genre. Jordan Peele himself has said that Scream heavily influenced his debut film, Get Out, and it's easy to see why. The entire concept of meta-horror, which means a horror movie which directly comments on the horror genre itself, was brought to the forefront of audience attention with Scream, though Wes Craven had attempted something similar with his Nightmare on Elm Street sequel, New Nightmare. That movie didn't really land, and although I like that movie quite a bit, I can absolutely see why the general public didn't warm to it. Movies such as Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, Cabin in the Woods, and Final Girls walked pretty heavily on a path paved by Scream. So what was it about Scream that resonated so heavily with audiences? First, let's talk about the plot of the film, which is actually quite good. Kevin Williamson wrote an amazing script that deserves a lot of the credit for the movie being such a towering presence in the horror genre, as the razor-sharp writing and interesting characters carry the film as much as the presence of meta-commentary on the genre. So Scream starts out following Casey Becker in the aforementioned introduction scene, who is at home getting ready to watch a scary movie when she gets a phone call. The call is at first thought to be a wrong number, and Casey playfully talks to the stranger over the phone until he freaks her out by asking her name so he can know who he's looking at. This kicks off the opening kill scene, which was shocking to audiences since Drew Barrymore was the biggest name in the movie at the time, fresh off the smash hit E.T., and she was also on the front of the poster. Drew Barrymore actually asked to play Casey Becker since she thought it would really surprise audiences to have her be killed in such a brutal way to start the movie, and it really sets the tone for the audience that no one is safe. After the brilliant opening kill, we spend the rest of the first act getting introduced to our characters, starting with the now iconic Sidney Prescott played by Neve Campbell. Her boyfriend, Billy, sneaks into her room when they introduce the fact that Sidney is a bit of a prude, which is a typical trait for a slasher final girl. You see, Wes and Kevin Williamson understand the tropes of the genre so well they built the entire film to both adhere to and subvert those tropes. They are playing off the audience expectations for the characters based on the patterns of previous slasher movies. But what makes Scream truly unique is in this movie, the characters themselves are aware of horror movies. Oftentimes, characters are experiencing something that is awfully similar to what happens in horror films, but for some reason the characters never address it. Scream is filled with characters that are not only aware of movies, but also constantly reference them. In Sidney and Billy's introduction, Billy goes on this little rant about how their relationship started hot and heavy, and he uses the MPAA ratings as a metaphor for their lack of sex life. This is only the beginning of a rampant, non-stop barrage of movie references, which I'm going to try and get them all for you here, but there are so many, I'm sure I missed some.
Halloween. Nightmare on Elm Street.
Halloween.
No. Michael Myers.
Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason!
The Exorcist was on.
We're talking splatter movie killed. Could easily be female. Basic instinct.
I'm gonna swing by the video store. I was thinking Tom Cruise and all the right moves.
You're starting to sound like some Wes Carpenter flick or something.
This is standard horror movie stuff. Prom night revisited, man. If they'd watch prom night, they'd save time.
God, look at this place. It's the town that dreaded sundown.
I see you as a young Meg Ryan myself.
Thanks, Dewey. With my luck, they'd guess Tori spelling.
How many Evil Deads? Yeah! How many Hellraisers?
Hellraiser, right here.
Fog, Terror Train, Prom Night. How come Jamie Lee Curtis is in all of these movies?
And what movie is this from? I spit on your garage. Cut, Casper. That's rap.
What's Leatherface doing here?
Like the bad seed or something.
It's like Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs when...
Why can't I be a Meg Ryan movie?
So I want to see Jamie Lee's breast. When do we see Jamie Lee's breast?
Breast? Not until Trading Places in '83.
Anthony Perkins, Psycho. Corn syrup. Same stuff they use for pig's blood and carrot. I don't really believe in motive, Sid. I mean, did Norman Bates have a motive?
No.
Did they ever really decide why Hannibal Lecter liked to eat people? Not like she was Sharon Stone or something.
Yeah, it would put her out of her misery. Because let's face it, Sydney, your mother was no Sharon Stone.
It is blatantly obvious Kevin Williamson is a huge horror fan and a huge fan of movies in general, so why shouldn't the characters he's writing be as well? Even the characters that don't talk about horror movies at all come off as very likable and genuine. Dewey is a bit of a goofball, but his chemistry with Courtney Cox is palpable, and the fact they later got married doesn't surprise me one bit. Brilliant bit of casting for those two roles. There are a bunch of minor characters who are also wonderful, led by Henry Winkler as the principal, who kinda sorta threatens to kill some kids with scissors before getting killed at the end of Act 2. Also, the main cast of kids are aged up, so when we see them having sex, killing people, or getting stabbed, it doesn't feel weird like it does when the kids actually look like they're 16. I really like the main cast, and I think they all fit their roles perfectly. One of the interesting things about these characters is they fit the general stereotype established by many horror movies before them. One of the mistakes movies that are trying to be smart make is breaking too many of the tropes, which ends up disrupting the magic of the tropes in the first place. Cabin in the Woods does a great job of explaining the character prototypes, but essentially, the virgin is the final girl and is defined by her purity, hence Sydney being established as not having sex in her introduction scene, marking her as being sin-free.
Whichever of you guys has never bought anything frivolous, go ahead and huck the next squirrel.
The final girl is typically contrasted with the whore, Cabin in the Woods words, not mine, in this case played by Rose McGowan, who is given tight shirts throughout the movie to accentuate her, promiscuity. The athlete is Billy, and while Billy does not play sports, he is described in the script as being a quarterback type. And in my opinion, this prototype is better described as the popular kid. Stu, played by Matthew Lillard, is the fool, meaning he's cracking jokes throughout the whole thing.
Better live her alone. Live her alone.
And last but not least, Randy is of course the scholar. He is the one who knows everything about horror movies and helps walk the audience through the tropes of the genre on multiple occasions. So what does adhering to these character prototypes do to help the story? Well, the masterful choice that Kevin and Wes made with the movie is to play off the audience expectations based on these tropes. The audience is trying to solve the mystery of who the killer is, and in the scene where all the main kids are sitting around the fountain at school, they are speculating about who it might be, and as kids would do, they are playfully accusing each other of being the killer. Stu is exonerated in this scene because he was with Tatum the night before, so we know it can't be him. Later, Billy is set up as the red herring. What that means is the movie is making it way too obvious that he is the killer, with the intention of tricking the audience later. The red herring trope is basically setting someone up to be the killer by showing them being creepy or scary or whatever, but oops, it's really the quiet, reserved guy.
You're absolutely right. I'm the first to admit it. If this were a scary movie, I'd be the prime suspect.
We see Billy with a cellular phone and it falls out of his pocket after Sydney is attacked, so the audience and Sydney herself think he is the killer. But oh wow, oh my god, the red herring turned out to be a red herring, and he isn't the killer because while Billy is in prison, Sydney gets another phone call from the killer. I have seen a lot of people online claim they called the killers in this movie, and okay, sure he did. Thinking Billy was the killer was literally the entire point of most of the film, but then the movie goes out of its way to eliminate both of them as suspects. The subversion they used to accomplish this is by having two killers, the trick which ended up defining the entire franchise. You see, generally we are looking for one killer, and Billy and Stu use that expectation to their advantage as a way to exonerate themselves in the eyes of the other characters. But also, Wes and Kevin used it to throw the audience off the scent. And for those of you who claim you knew Billy was the killer, how did you feel in the scene where he's killed by the killer? There's no way you predicted there were 2 killers and they were faking his death. Come on, stop lying to yourself. This sleight of hand to trick the audience only works because the characters in the movie are aware of horror movies and other movies in general. Billy even references that they used the corn syrup trick from Carrie, and later has his iconic line that movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative, which touches on one of the major themes of the movie, which is whether watching horror movies makes people more violent. There was a lot of fire and fury in the 90s about whether violent video games or movies would desensitize kids to violence and make them more likely to attack people or whatever. This has pretty much been settled, and most people don't think that anymore, but it was a really big deal at the time.
He's sick, for fuck's sake. You've seen one too many movies.
Nah, Sid, don't you blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative.
That one line essentially summarized Kevin and Wes's thoughts on the matter, and Billy personifies the concept as a character. Do we really think he wouldn't have tried to kill Sydney to get back at her for Sydney's mother breaking up his family? He's always been a little bit stab happy, so I think we both know the answer to that, but it was only because of movies he devised his ridiculous and convoluted plot. So what even was their plan? I think something a lot of people miss about this movie is Billy and Stu are trying to recreate a horror movie in real life. If Billy's plan is to kill Sydney as payback, then why bother killing Casey Becker? She didn't do anything wrong, except using this adultish method of making popcorn. She wasn't involved in the situation at all, so why go through the trouble? Billy did it for a few reasons. One of them is to exonerate Stu by having him be with Tatum while the murder happens, but obviously there is more to it than that because he engages in the ridiculous farce of calling Casey and playing the little phone game with her first. So the second reason is to establish a phone trail when the police pull the cell phone number. It shows Sydney's father, who they plan to frame by cloning a cell phone, but thirdly it also sets up the inciting incident for their in-universe horror movie. So what other evidence do I have that this is the case? Well, when Sydney is attacked in a later scene, they go through with the cell phone call thing again, kinda just to mess with her, but Ghostface knocks her down and has the knife right at her throat. So let's pause here. Why doesn't Ghostface kill her? The entire point of this is for Billy to get his revenge on Sydney, right? So why not just end it right here? The reason is Billy and Stu are trying to follow horror movie tropes and Sydney is still a virgin. As Randy discusses later,
are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
And in case you question my leaps of logic here, Stu literally confirms it in the conclusion.
You gave it up. Now you're no longer a virgin. That virgin. Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
So, Ghostface intentionally lets Sydney escape in this scene, setting up Billy coming in as a suspect and to be exonerated by the phone call when Sydney is at Tatum's. Hopefully you are starting to see why Kevin Williamson's script is such a masterpiece here. I mean, this movie's got more layers than an ogre.
Layers! Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers.
Another aspect of the attack on Sydney I wanted to talk about is how Sydney is not a fan of horror movies. When they call, she is very condescending about them.
What's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
Sydney's view of horror movies is shared by a lot of actual audience members, and they feel horror movie characters are stupid. There was even a dumb commercial about horror characters going to hide behind chainsaws because everyone in horror movies is so dumb. So many people repeat this when in reality it's mostly bullshit. You see, it is easy to criticize and talk about how if you were in a situation where someone was trying to murder you with a knife from close range, you would do such a great job and make perfect decisions and not do anything silly or stupid at all. Most people nowadays are too afraid to call a restaurant to make a reservation, and you expect me to believe the average teenager is going to fend off a serial killer in perfect fashion? They don't even know they're in a horror movie. Well, Sydney ends up making the exact mistake she was criticizing characters in horror movies for making, by trying to go out the front door and finding it is locked, which she did herself moments ago, and then having to run up the stairs anyway. Ghostface is just barely behind her, and in the moment it feels kind of convenient he doesn't catch her or stab her here, but remember, Stu and Billy aren't actually trying to kill her here since she's still a virgin, so there is an actual in-universe reason why Ghostface fails. Another example is back at the fountain scene when Sydney asks the rhetorical question of how someone would even gut a person. She is not really looking for an answer, but Stu goes ahead and starts answering anyway. And then Billy interrupts him, in part because Billy doesn't want Stu giving away that they're the killers, and some audience members would probably say this tipped them off he was the killer, but if those same audience members were paying attention, they would know it couldn't have been Stu since he was at Tatum's that night. Womp womp. Another common criticism of this movie I hear is how Ghostface shows up in the grocery store and in the bushes outside Tatum's house.
You know, if I was wrong about Cotton Weary, then the killer's still out there.
Don't go there, Sam. You're starting to sound like some Wes Carpenter flick or something. Don't freak yourself out, okay? We've got a long night ahead of us.
This is definitely kind of weird, and to be honest, it feels more like the studio watching the movie and deciding the middle part was a bit boring and telling Wes to add in some more jump scares to spice things up a bit. That may be the case, I honestly have no idea, but since Billy and Stu are trying to create an in-universe horror movie, these scenes also work as them hovering around the perimeter in the hope Sidney notices them, much in the same way Laurie notices Michael Myers chilling by her clothesline in the original Halloween. It doesn't really make sense for Ghostface to be doing those things, but Billy and Stu's commitment to making a horror movie goes way beyond normal logic and reason. The movie culminates with The Party, which lasts almost half the runtime of the film. The pacing of Scream is amazing, and the script just pulls you along with quality characters, snappy dialogue, plot development, and enough twists to keep everything fresh. I wanted to touch on the theme of violence in movies causing violence in real life again, since the camera gal and her camera dude setup is on the television and is watching the party. There is this funny dynamic at play where the characters in the movie we are watching a movie we know exists, in this case Halloween, while other characters in the movie we are watching those characters watch the movie. The terminal conclusion of this satire is when Ghostface is about to stab Randy while he pleads for Jamie Lee Curtis to look behind him, and at this point, we like Randy, so we don't want him to get stabbed. So we are pleading for him to turn around, just like he's pleading for Laurie to turn around. Sidney and the cameraman join in, but forget about the delay on the camera, so Ghostface has already run out to the van and slashes the cameraman's throat, clearly implicating an obsession with screens as a replacement for real life is problematic. Instead of yelling at the screen, they should have been trying to help Randy in real life, and if they had, the camera guy would have likely lived. This critique of obsession with screens and the media in general is hinted at several other times in the film, mostly through Gail's hilarious commitment to helping herself over any ethical or emotional concerns about how her actions might impact others. The movie ends with Gail, who literally just survived the attacks by Ghostface, getting a camera and a microphone and reporting on the incident because she knows her actual story doesn't really matter as much as making sure the new viewing audiences are aware of the carnage. You see, Wes feels people in general are attracted to violence, which is why when there is a murder of some kind, all the cameras come out. When people critique horror fans for liking to watch violence, they most likely love watching violent news and are clearly not without sin and should not be throwing squirrels.
Whichever of you guys has never bought anything frivolous, go ahead and huck the next squirrel.
Overall, Scream is a monumental figure in the horror genre. The script is amazing and pulls numerous tricks on the audience, taking familiar tropes and weaponizing them at both the characters in the story and the people watching at home. The audience and characters expect one killer, and so Billy and Stu use that against everyone, providing alibis for each other. The characters are developed using the familiar prototypes, but are still developed well and each has their distinct personality that serves a typical purpose in a horror film. The direction is great, the minor characters shine in their respective roles, and everything comes together in a brilliant, shining, triumphant way that has never truly been captured since, despite studios desperately trying every few years. No matter what comes next, Scream has left a permanent mark on movies forever, and it certainly left quite the impression on me, both when I was a kid learning that it's okay to be obsessed with movies, and as an adult who spends way too much of his free time sharing his love in a way that would make Randy proud due to their shared horror obsession.